Okay, welcome. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about food and boarding schools, and especially drawing upon a few examples. I've got Freddie Mercury here and his experiences at boarding school, and people like David Cameron, also Charles Spencer. So just drawing from a few different people and what their experiences were, and just how that impacts us growing up. So enjoy. Okay, so yeah, I bought this book a few days ago, Love of My Life, with Freddie Mercury. It's by Leslie Ann Jones, and as many of you know, I've got many books behind me, biographies. I'll go into the local charity shops and I just see if there's a biography, and I just look through to see if they've been to boarding school or not. And many, it turns out, have been to boarding school, so I kind of buy them and then read the stories, and I'm always intrigued. So Freddie Mercury here, he went to boarding school in India. He was brought up in Zanzibar, but his parents sent him to India to a boarding school called St. Peter's, which is interesting. It's also the name of Justin Welby's boarding school, although Justin Welby's was in Seaford, the UK. His was near, I think it was the south of India. So he would go, Freddie Mercury would go from Zanzibar over to India, and he would go home once a year. So he saw his parents once. He would usually go and spend time with his aunts. I think it was in Bombay in the holiday time. But as I was reading through, he's talking about food. So I thought, oh, interesting. And because there's a few people who talk about it, the general consensus is that I've read is the food in most boarding schools is pretty horrific. It is, and I'll read some of my diary entries from when I was 11. He says, apart from that is the food. Oh my goodness, the food at my school was god awful. At St. Peter's, it was even worse. The world's worst, Freddie Mercury used to say. He used to be called Bucky because of his teeth at school. We had no choice but to eat it. We would have starved otherwise. There was nothing else. Freddie displayed an incredibly modest appetite later in life. It seems likely that dreadful school dinners were at least in part to blame. So this is something I wanted to touch on a bit, is that in my one-to-one work with ex-boarders, is many of them have stomach issues. And I too have had stomach issues since I was young. And I remember being at boarding school having really bad stomach ache. So I'll just read you a little bit from, this is my diary from age 11, and some diary entries. This is the 9th of February 1987. Lunch was pretty disgusting, but for pudding, instead of having apple crumble, we had strawberry crumble. The strawberries were from last year. I think that was a reference to them being horrible and rancid. And also this thing here, my next two lessons were double food and nutrition with this teacher. We made scones, which were lovely. She let us out 10 minutes early because she thinks it will give us time to get the food back to house without scroungers being around. So this is an 11-year-old boy who the teacher is letting them out of food and nutrition early so that people don't steal their food. And I think that's a really key point to bring up about food in these institutions, is that there wasn't a lot of food. There was very little, especially the first couple of years. And if you did get some, then often people would steal it from you. So you weren't relaxed. And I think that partly, therefore, creates the stomach problems later in life, because we can't relax around food. Joy Chavrian says in her book, Boarding School Syndrome, this idea that, eating in a huge space is not a relaxing environment. I've heard of both men and women their experiences at school, they wouldn't even go into the dining room. They would prefer not to eat rather than to be in that kind of toxic environment. So what's another one? For breakfast, we had cornflakes followed by the usual sausages, yuck, and fried bread. And I remember speaking to one of my friends, and he said that, we used to have waffles, which were deep fried, and there was so much oil in them. You used to have to get 2 slices of bread and squash the waffle inside to get rid of all the grease. So this is Joy Shavarian, and she says here, if there was any stale bread left, it had to be eaten before the palatable fresh bread would be served. The meat they were given was condemned as unfit for human consumption, and it was always full of veins and tubes. And I remember that, having to pull out pieces of gristle from my my food. And then she talks about here of someone finding a worm in their food, and that kind of links me on to Rachel Johnson in an article she wrote in, I believe it was the Times, just talking about her experiences at boarding school. She says she enjoyed it on one level, but her stories, she's saying that she found maggots in her food and said to the headmaster, "Oh, I've found maggots." And the headmaster says, "Oh, there you go, you've got some protein there, eat it." And she then talks about how she was so hungry that she used to eat her own toothpaste. Then we've got David Cameron with a very similar story here. This is page 21. The food was Spartan. I lost a stone in weight during a single term. There was one meal that consisted of curry, rice and maggots. So just, putting that into context, it's like, wow, he lost a stone in weight. And that kind of links me into, neglect. In the work of David Howe, who I spoke on my podcast a number of, I think it was last year, this idea that neglect is even more damaging to the developing child and its brain than acute abuse. And the NSPCC says neglect is the ongoing failure to meet a child's basic needs and the most common form of child abuse. A child might be left hungry or dirty or without proper clothing, supervision or shelter. And I think this is important to note that many of these people talk in these stories about the food being terrible, there not being enough, of them being hungry. Again, if I just draw upon another well-known person who went to boarding school, Eddie Izzard. So he went age 6. And Eddie Izzard, he says here, so I was 6 when I went off to boarding school. I think that my childlike character that appears in my stand-up now was locked off at 6. He says, the food was awful at boarding school, and I had a real food problem, a real basic palate. My brother was eating Indian food, and I could only eat potatoes. That's why I wanted to be in the army, because they were always peeling potatoes, and I thought, well, I like potatoes, so... And this school served macaroni with warm milk. I mean, what the fuck was that? I've never seen that since. So just reading and understanding, okay, a lot of these people had, really, really terrible food. But the final book I wanted to read was Charles Spencer's, just to show that not all the food at boarding school was bad. He says, lunch was the best of meals, presumably because it was the only one where the teaching staff ate with us. We knew from playing sports against other private schools in the area that we had the best food around, thanks to Annie and her careful management of the kitchen budget. The finest of the dishes were familiar to us from home. The only lunch that caused general alarm was liver, served in a thick sharp of gravy. We were given this once or twice a term. Occasionally a boy would slice open his liver to reveal a thick tube running through it. That and the occasional appearance of bitter root crop swede as the vegetable of the day made for a long lunch, as boys really struggled to finish what was on their plates. he also talks about in here about the food. And he says basically that you had to eat everything on your plate. You weren't allowed to leave the table without it. So yeah, just some thoughts. I just thought it was interesting reading Freddie Mercury's book. That's like, oh, there's a few people who've spoken about that, about the food. So not everyone's food was bad, but in general, food was almost scrimped upon. That the school didn't pay a lot of money for the food. They try to save money, just as they try to save money with the teachers. So yeah, if you find this interesting, yeah, if you went to boarding school, what was your school food like? Was it really palatable, great, or maybe like Prince Charles says, King Charles, or some of these other people, there wasn't a lot of food, or the food was pretty Spartan or terrible, as David Cameron says. So yeah, please do comment below. And yeah, this Friday I've got a podcast going live talking about a man who helps work with people in prisons, doing this thing called anonymous drama, so using drama therapy, which is really fascinating. So that will go live this Friday. Okay, take care.